In Boston politics, there's a widely acknowledged pattern of using public leverage on private assets for community benefit. In federal court, a jury recently decided that efforts in that direction by aides to Mayor Walsh involving a concert on City Hall Plaza went too far. The aides were found guilty of extortion and conspiracy, but 2 weeks later, a majority of Boston city councilors and several activists jointly cried foul. To explain that dissenting opinion is the district councilor for East Boston, Charlestown in the North End, Lydia Edwards. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank
Councilor.
you very much.
You're also an attorney. I'm sure you're following this Boston Calling case very closely. And given the dots that were connected by prosecutors, were you really surprised at the verdict?
Yes, considering the actual directions to the jury, and I felt the initially judge, I think, long while
Sorokin,
had dismissed the case, so I was surprised.
Well, I think the argument they had was that because the concert organizers had some kind of fear they were going to suffer financial damage, that was just too much pressure to be putting on them to give these jobs to union workers.
Yeah, if you fear financial damage for providing good paying jobs or, I don't know, developing and housing and having to do more affordable units, and to me, you are not good at the business that you're in. I don't think that you should not leverage the fact that you have to pay more to workers as fear of financial damage. I think fear of financial damage includes shutting you down permanently, never having access to City Hall, and also let's not forget, they had every intention of stealing these workers' wages. That's how they started this conversation. They wanted to pay them in T-shirts. They wanted to charge people to work for them, and that's what got them in the room.
So what about these union workers? Do you find that, were they actually working, adding some value to this concert that wasn't there before?
Really, honestly, I don't know. I do believe that Boston Calling and this union have a perfectly fine working relationship going forward. So they managed to work it out. I think the question before all of us is whether this should have been prosecuted as a crime. I don't begrudge the jury. They were asked this question. They had to answer it. They were not going to please everybody. But going back to why the question was even asked to them, is this a crime? Is this actual extortion that someone was providing union jobs? And for no personal benefit. And I want to emphasize this. I don't believe either of the men received anything. If they had received a T-shirt, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But they received nothing.
Was the issue here really about how much benefit anybody got out of this, including the mayor, or was it really about pressure on the organizers?
I think the issue for many of us going forward is if you don't receive anything and you are applying pressure for something that they don't want to do, and that is now extortion, we could all potentially be charged. For example, I don't know if you saw recently, a group came out saying they felt that they were victims of extortion because they were forced to have LGBTQ veterans, vets, march in the St. Patrick's Day parade. That's the door that's open now. That having to associate with LGBTQ members of our families, our neighborhoods, that's a form of extortion and pressure, doing something they didn't want to do.
Certainly, one of the first things I worried about was linkage, the money from developers that channeled into affordable housing. Do you think that's threatened by this?
I think the entire system, our Boston jobs policy, linkage payments, sitting down with developers and saying we need more affordable units, all of those things, because every time you sit down as an elected official, there's a certain level of pressure in the room. And there's a certain amount of ask that you're going to have for your constituents. And again, I am not saying, therefore, that means we stop doing that. I am saying we've just given a tool in a toolbox for those who want to oppose good jobs, anti-discrimination policies, oppose diversity. All of those folks now have one more tool in the toolbox.
Now, one of the things I was also wondering about here, this is a case that involved a license or a permit for an event. Isn't that somehow different from linkage, which is involving, the city grants the zoning variance? It means the city's doing a favor for a developer, and in return, the city gets something. Isn't that a different dynamic?
We wrote that down. That's the different dynamic. And so what that means for many of us is that we need to go back and write down what it means to get a permit, what it means to get additional variances, what it means to develop and do business in Boston. And we're happy to go back and raise those standards because of this decision.
Of course, what you're also talking about here is not so much the verdict or even the activities in City Hall is a decision to bring this case in. It was won by a Trump appointee, but it was started by an Obama appointee.
Yeah, so I'm not, and I think people also confuse political agenda with meaning it means either one of the presidents. Corporations can have a political agenda. People who are against civil rights have a political agenda. And if you choose to prosecute a case wherein people got good union jobs at the end result, that could be a part of an anti-union, anti-labor political agenda.
This has been the news, and we're talking with Boston City Councilor Lydia Edwards. Councilor, speaking of linkage, there was a vote this week by the City Council to, I guess, up the bar for developers and get more resources for affordable housing. Explain, what are the details here?
So the vote basically says two things. One, it's sending up to the State House a home rule petition that allows for Boston going forward to up or lower, or to raise or lower the linkage on our own without having to seek permission from the State House. So if passed, now Boston has a certain amount of autonomy, which we're very excited about. But also it allows for us to look at the economic pressures, look at the economic booms, looking at all the ways in which we can exact more benefits for our communities, for our neighborhood housing trust and our neighborhood jobs trust as well. It's a very exciting moment, and the fact that it got through and it's going to the State House, we really do hope our colleagues in the State House do the right thing.
Well, up to this point, I think the standard set aside from developers is something like 13% for affordable housing. How much is that supposed to increase now?
Well, that's the point. We would be able to have that conversation in Boston. We don't need to make it statewide. And so we don't have an absolute set amount that we're in mind, or not all of us do. I certainly have some higher percentages than maybe some of my colleagues, but it should be a Boston conversation to have.
As a conversation with you, what would you like to see it be?
It depends on the size of the project. The bigger the project, the bigger the percentage. I've heard some folks talk as high as 33%, a third. I've been more comfortable with about 20% on some of the projects that are very, very large. And then, whether 13% makes sense, or cash buyout, or buying units in other places makes sense, that's, I think, all for us to decide.
Of course, the other thing going on here is that when we raise a percentage, most of that money is coming from the developers themselves, unless the city adds some value to their project. Isn't there got to be a limit somewhere?
Yes, it's called the market forces, and a lot of those developers at the table to help drive that limit or to raise it. They're right there with us, and I think that this is the conversation that we've been needing to have on a regular basis in Boston with them.
Now, another kind of a project that you're having to contend with in East Boston is where to put the pot shop and where to put the next one if it's not too close.
Right.
How has that been working out?
Well, I think what we realized is that the ZBA didn't have the clarification it needed in the zoning code about what a half mile was in terms of an existing or non-existing pot shop. So we sent back an amendment to the zoning code that basically says it's existing or seeking zoning relief or needing a host community agreement. That really helps to clarify what the half mile means. And then, just like any other zoning provision, you can apply for a variance. It's not set in stone. You can go there and make your argument as to why you should get exception to the rule. I think in this case, we're talking about a couple hundred feet outside or inside of the half mile buffer, and maybe they have a good argument as to why they should be granted that relief.
Finally, Governor Baker recently came up with some ideas for reducing traffic congestion. It's the whole metropolitan area. You've got a lot of that in East Boston. Is that moving in the right direction, or are there some other things that you'd like to see?
I'd love to see some waterfront transportation, looking at a ferry service. I'd love to see congestion tolling. I'd love to see the governor go back and look at Sumner Tunnel and make sure it's really moving the traffic in a way that's not going through East Boston as a neighborhood, but staying on the highway. So I'm happy that we're talking about traffic again. We have some issues. I'd also like to see there be some parity. Look, it costs more to take the T into Boston and out than it does to drive in and out. And I think at the very minimum, if you're going to raise the T prices for folks who are using public transportation, you should also raise what people pay to drive in and out of Boston.
Congestion tolling, I imagine it's going to be very controversial. It's not just for upper middle class people, but there are people who've been displaced from the city, even from East Boston, who might have to pay that. Do you ever worry about that too?
They're paying now more for public transportation. A lot of the people who have the economic disadvantages are on the buses or on the T's. They're not the ones driving necessarily into Boston every day. So again, I asked for parity. I didn't ask for it to be even more, significantly expensive. I just asked that to drive in and to take the T should be an equal economic burden.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
City Councilor Lydia Edwards. In a moment, we'll tell you about a summit for young professionals in Mattapan.